The night was cold, colder than any winter she had known on her homeworld. The streets of the human colony were quiet, covered with a thin layer of frost that crunched under her bare feet. The alien girl pulled her torn coat tighter around herself, but it did little to stop the icy wind from biting into her skin. She had been walking for hours, looking for a place to sleep, somewhere with walls to keep out the wind and a roof to keep off the snow. But everywhere she went, doors closed in. Her face, some humans glared at her with open hatred. Others didn't even bother to speak before shutting the door. She couldn't blame them, not entirely. Her kind had been the enemy once during the war, and memories of that time still lingered in every human heart. Now, she was just another face from a hated species. Unwanted and unwelcome, her breath came. Out in shaky clouds as she walked, her legs ached and her hands were numb. She had no gloves, no shoes. Nothing except the coat she had scavenged from a trash heap 2 winters ago. It smelled of smoke and old food, but it was all she had. The colony's lights flickered faintly, casting long shadows between the buildings. The silence was broken only by the hum of distant power generators. She passed another row of houses, each one warm and lit from within. The smell of food drifted from a chimney, making her stomach twist painfully. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. She thought about knocking, just once more. But fear held her back. She reached the edge of the street, where the lights grew dimmer and the houses older. Here, the roofs sagged and the walls were patched with metal sheets. Her eyes landed on a small house at the very end of the road. It had a single yellow light glowing in the window, soft and warm. The smoke from its chimney rose lazily into the sky. It looked different from the others, not rich, not new, but alive. She stood at the gate for a long moment, her hands trembling. She told herself not to hope, not again. She had learned long ago that hope could hurt worse than hunger. Still, her feet carried her forward, crunching softly on the frozen ground. She reached the door and hesitated. Her heart pounded. What if this human threw her out like the rest? What if he called the patrol to have her removed or worse? Finally, she raised her hand and knocked. The sound echoed in the still night. A few seconds later, the door opened and a human man stood there. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a thick jacket and gloves. His dark hair was messy, and his eyes scanned her quickly. For a moment, she expected the usual, the cold stare, the disgust, the order to leave. Instead, he frowned, but not in anger. "You look frozen," he said quietly, his voice deep and calm. She didn't answer. Her throat felt dry, and the words wouldn't come. She just stared at him, unsure. The warm air from inside drifted past him and wrapped around her like a gentle hand. She could hear the faint crackle of a fire. It made her chest ache because it had been years since she had felt that kind of warmth. "You're not from around here," he said after a moment, though his tone suggested he already knew. She gave the smallest shake of her head. Her voice came out as a whisper. I just need somewhere to sleep." The man's eyes studied her for a long time. She braced herself for the door to close, for the rejection she knew was coming. But instead, he stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said simply. Her heart skipped. She hesitated. She had been warned about humans, about their tricks, about how kindness could be a trap. Still, the cold pushed her forward, and she stepped into the light. The warmth hit her immediately, sinking into her bones. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and something cooking, stew. Maybe. The room was small but neat, with shelves lined with books and tools. A large bed sat against the wall, covered in thick blankets. She stopped, unsure of where to stand, afraid to touch anything. The man shut the door and locked it, then walked past her to the fireplace. He stirred the logs and added another piece of wood. The flames flared, filling the room with a golden glow. "Sit," he said, pointing to a chair near the fire. She obeyed without a word. Her frozen hands reached toward the warmth, and she could feel the sting as her skin began to thaw. The man didn't speak for a while, just busied himself in the small kitchen corner. Finally, he turned and placed a steaming mug in front of her. "Drink," he said. "It'll help." She stared at it, then at him. This was not what she had expected. No shouting, no threats, no demand for payment, just warmth. Her mind raced with questions, but her voice trembled when she finally asked, Why are you helping me?" The man glanced at her, his eyes unreadable. "Because you knocked," he said simply. Outside, the cold wind howled. Inside, the fire crackled, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something strange, the faint, dangerous spark of hope. The mug was warm in her hands, and the steam curled into her face, carrying the smell of something sweet and herbal. She sipped carefully, feeling the heat spread down her throat and into her chest. It almost hurt, after so many nights of cold. She kept glancing at the human, unsure of him, unsure of his intentions. Humans didn't just give warmth and food to someone like her, not without wanting something in return. He moved quietly, setting a small pot over the fire. The stew inside bubbled slowly, filling the room with a richer smell. Her stomach growled, and she pulled the blanket he had draped over her shoulders tighter. Embarrassed that he might have heard, he glanced at her, a faint smile touching his face. But he said nothing. Finally he spoke, his voice calm. "You can rest here tonight." Her eyes flickered toward the door, then toward him, on her world. Offers like that had hidden meanings, especially when it came from a stranger, especially when it involved his home. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted softly. "Then it's settled," he said, without hesitation. "You can take the bed." Her head snapped up, her alien eyes narrowing in confusion. "The bed?" she repeated, as if the words didn't make sense. He nodded toward the large bed in the corner, its blankets thick and inviting. "I'll take the chair," he added, as though it were obvious the idea made no sense to her. Beds, in her culture, were personal, sacred even. They were for family, lovers, or those bound by deep trust. Sharing a bed, or giving one away, meant something far more intimate than humans seemed to realize. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged. "Because you need it more than I do." She stared at him for a long moment, searching for the trap. She had lived too long without kindness to believe in it easily. Still, the fire was warm, and the thought of sleeping on something soft. It pulled at her, but fear pulled harder. He noticed her hesitation. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said quietly. "Sleep here tonight, then decide if you want to stay longer." Stay longer. The words echoed in her head. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked her to stay anywhere. She looked again at the bed. The blankets looked impossibly soft. The pillow full. It was nothing like the hard floors or cold alleys she was used to. She swallowed hard and nodded. "All right," she said. His shoulders relaxed slightly. "Good," he replied. "I'll finish the stew first." They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the occasional clink of spoons against bowls. The stew was thick, full of vegetables and some kind of meat. It was richer than anything she had eaten in years. When she finished, she set the empty bowl down, almost afraid to ask for more. He noticed, and without a word, refilled it. That small act shook her more than she expected. When the food was gone and the fire had burned lower, he stood. "You should sleep," he said. She hesitated, her gaze shifting between him and the bed. Finally, she stood and walked toward it, each step feeling heavier than it should. She sat on the edge, the mattress sinking slightly under her weight. It was softer than anything she'd felt in years. Her hands gripped the blanket, unsure if she was allowed to pull it over herself. He noticed her uncertainty. "It's yours for the night," he said. "Use it." Then he moved to the chair near the fire, taking off his jacket and draping it over the back. She watched him, her alien eyes reflecting the firelight. It was strange, seeing a human turn. His back on her, a sign of trust, or perhaps recklessness. Slowly, she slid under the blanket, the warmth wrapping around her. Her muscles ached, but the softness soothed them. She had forgotten what it felt like to be held by something warm that wasn't another body. She lay there, stiff at first, listening to the quiet. The human was leaning back in the chair, eyes half closed. The firelight flickered across his face, making his features softer. She wanted to ask him more questions, who he was, why he lived alone, why he was helping her, but the weight of exhaustion pressed her down. Her eyes began to close. Just before sleep took her, she whispered, "I have never slept in a warm bed before." She wasn't sure if he heard her, but his voice came low and almost sleepy. "Then it's about time you did." Outside, the wind howled, cold and unforgiving. Inside, the fire kept burning, and for the first time in years, she felt safe enough to close her eyes, yet deep inside, a question remained. Why was this human risking his comfort, maybe even his safety, for someone like her? She didn't know the answer, but she knew she would find out. The fire had burned low, casting the room in a dim orange glow. The alien girl lay under the thick blanket, her body warm for the first time in years, but her mind would not rest. She kept glancing at the human in the chair, watching the way. The flames reflected in his half-closed eyes. He looked calm, maybe even tired, but there was something about him that made her curious. Who was he really, and why was he helping her? The soft ticking of an old clock filled the silence between them. She shifted slightly, the bed creaking under her. Her alien ears caught sounds outside that humans might have missed. Faint footsteps crunching on the frozen ground. She froze, her body tense. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard. Her pulse quickened. She had been hunted before, and she knew what it sounded like when someone was searching for her. The human must have noticed her change, because he straightened in his chair, his eyes narrowing toward the door. "You hear that too?" he asked quietly. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "They're looking for me." He stood silently, moving to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough. He peeked out into the night. She watched his jaw tighten. A faint shadow moved across the snow-covered street, followed by another, two figures, both dressed in heavy coats. But the way they moved was too precise, too careful. They weren't just passing by, they were searching. He let the curtain fall back into place and turned to her. "You need to stay quiet," he said, his voice low but firm. Her hands gripped the blanket, her claws pressing into the fabric. "They'll smell me," she whispered, panic edging into her voice. The human looked around the small room, then pointed to the space under the bed. "Hide," he said. She hesitated. Hiding there made her feel trapped, but there was no time to argue. She slid off the bed and onto the cold floor, crawling into the narrow space beneath. The dust and faint smell of wood filled her nose. She pulled the blanket from the bed to cover herself. The firelight disappeared from her view, replaced by the shadowed underside of the bed frame. A knock came at the door, hard and sharp. The human walked over and opened it just enough to face whoever was outside. Two voices spoke, low but not low enough for her alien ears. "We're looking for someone." One of them said, "She's not welcome here. Orders from the council." The human's voice stayed calm. "You see anyone around here?" he asked. "No," one of the strangers replied, "but her kind doesn't survive long in this cold, unless—" The man's voice trailed off, the implication hanging in the air. The human shifted, blocking more of the doorway. "Unless—" "What?" he asked, his tone now edged with warning. The second stranger's boots stepped closer to the door. "She's dangerous, human. You should tell us if you've seen her." "She's not here," the human said flatly. "You sure about that?" The first one pressed. A moment later, the sound of heavy steps moved into the doorway, and a shadow fell across the floor. Her heart pounded as she saw boots stop just inches from where she hid. Then a hand dropped low, sweeping under the bed. Her breath caught in her throat. The human's voice snapped sharply. "Step back." The hand froze, then slowly withdrew. "Check somewhere else," the human said, his voice final. The footsteps retreated, and after a tense pause, the door closed. For a long moment, the room was silent except for her racing heartbeat. She stayed still, afraid to move, until his voice came. "You can come out now." She crawled out from under the bed, brushing dust from her coat. Her eyes met his, and she saw something there, not fear, but determination. "You lied for me," she said quietly. "I protected you," he corrected. "There's a difference." She didn't know what to say to that. In her world, lies and protection rarely came together. But here, in this strange human's home, she was starting to see things differently. Still, the knock, the voices, the searching. It reminded her of the danger she brought with her. "They'll come back," she said, her voice heavy. "Then we'll be ready," he replied without hesitation. She stared at him, wondering what kind of man would choose to stand between her and the world outside. She wanted to ask why, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she lay back down in the bed, her eyes still fixed on him. He returned to the chair, poking at the fire until the flames grew brighter again. The warmth slowly filled the room once more, but now it carried a weight, the quiet understanding that they were no longer safe. As the night stretched on, she listened to every sound. Outside, the wind, the shifting ice, the distant hum of machines. And somewhere out there, she knew, those footsteps would return. But for now, she was in a bed, warm and alive, and there was a human who had just lied to protect her. It was the strangest comfort she had ever felt. And she didn't know if she would ever want to let it go. The wind had grown louder outside, whistling through the cracks in the old window frames. The alien girl lay still under the blankets, but her eyes stayed open, fixed on the shadowy ceiling. Above, she couldn't stop replaying the moment when the stranger's hand had reached under the bed. She had been seconds away from being dragged out into the cold. Her chest tightened at the thought. The human sat in the chair by the fire, but he wasn't sleeping. Every so often, he glanced at the door, listening for sounds beyond it. The logs in the fireplace popped softly, sending faint sparks upward. The warmth was comforting, but it felt like fragile safety, something that could shatter at any moment. Hours passed in silence. Then deep into the night, a sound cut through the wind. 3 sharp knocks, not like before. These were heavier, harder, each one rattling the wood of the door. Her eyes flew to the human. He was already standing, his jaw set. The knocks came again, louder this time. A deep voice followed, muffled through the door. "We know she's in there." Her blood ran cold. The human stepped closer to the door, but didn't open it. "Go away," he said firmly. There was a pause. Then the sound of boots shifting on the wooden porch. "You're making a mistake." "Human," the voice called. "She's not worth dying for." The human glanced over his shoulder at her. His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. "Stay where you are," he said, his voice low. She clutched the blanket tighter. The air felt heavier, as if the cold itself was pressing against the walls. The voice outside grew sharper. "You have until the count of 3 to open this door." Her breathing quickened. She could almost feel the danger on the other side. "1," the voice said. The human reached to the table by the wall, his hand closing around a small metal object. A weapon, but not like the blaster she had seen in the war. This one was older, heavier. He cocked it with a sharp click. "2," the voice called again. The human moved to the door, his stance calm but ready. The girl wanted to shout at him to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there. But her voice was trapped in her throat. "3," the voice finished. The door shuddered as someone slammed into it. The hinges groaned under the force. The human didn't move back. Instead, he shouted, "Try it again, and I'll make sure you don't walk away." Silence followed. The cold air leaked through the edges of the door, carrying with it the faint smell of engine fuel. They had transport waiting, she realized. If they caught her, they would take her far from here. Another voice spoke from outside, lower and colder. "All right, human, keep her for now." Heavy footsteps moved away from the porch. The sound of an engine starting rumbled faintly in the distance. Her heart didn't slow until the sound faded into the wind. The human locked the door, then walked back to the fire, setting the weapon on the table. "They'll be back," he said simply. She sat up, her voice shaky. "Why didn't you give me to them?" He looked at her as though the question didn't make sense. "Because you don't belong to them," he replied. "And you're not going anywhere." Her throat tightened at his words. No one had ever spoken about her like that, not since. Before the war, for years she had been treated as something to trade, to sell, to use. But this human. He spoke to her like she was a person, not a burden. She swung her legs out of the bed, moving closer to the fire. "They'll send more," she whispered. "Then we'll be ready," he said again, as if it was the simplest truth in the world. He began checking the windows, making sure they were locked. Every movement he made was deliberate, prepared. She could see now he wasn't just some quiet man living alone. He was someone who had been in danger before, someone who knew how to survive it. The flames crackled, shadows dancing on the walls. She sat quietly, feeling the heat of the fire and the weight of his words. She didn't know how long this safety would last, but for tonight, she was still here, still in the bed that wasn't cold, still alive, but deep down, she understood something. The knock at midnight was only the beginning. The real danger had yet to come, and when it did, she would have to decide whether to keep running or stand and face it with him. Morning came without sunlight. Thick clouds covered the sky, and the cold was sharper than before. The alien girl woke to the smell of burning wood and the faint sound of metal being moved. She sat up, the blanket falling from her shoulders. The human was at the table, sorting through a small pile of supplies, a coil of rope, a flashlight, some food wrapped in cloth, and a battered map. She rubbed her eyes, confused. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice still heavy with sleep. He didn't look up. "Getting ready to leave," he said. Her heart skipped. "Leave? Why?" He finally looked at her, his face calm but serious. "Because they'll be back," he said. "And next time, they won't just knock." The memory of the heavy pounding at midnight sent a shiver through her. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "They won't stop, will they?" "No," he said simply. "Not until they have you." Her stomach tightened. She had been running for so long that she didn't even know what it felt like to stay in one place without fear. Now, just when she had found warmth and safety, it was slipping away. He rolled up the map and tucked it into his jacket. "There's a place beyond the colony, far enough that they won't look for you there," he explained. "It's not much, but it's safe." She studied him for a moment. "You'd go with me?" she asked carefully. He gave a small nod. "I'm not letting you walk into the cold alone." She swallowed hard. Part of her wanted to say no, not because she didn't want him there, but because she feared what would happen to him if he stayed by her side. Yet, the thought of leaving without him made her chest ache. The human packed the last of the supplies into a small bag and slung it over his shoulder. "We move before sunset," he said. "Why not now?" she asked. "Because in daylight, they'll see us," he replied. "Night will give us cover." The day passed slowly. They kept the fire small, the curtains closed, and every sound from outside made them tense. Once, she thought she heard voices in the street. The human moved silently to the window and peeked out, his hand resting near the weapon on the table. The voices faded, but the air in the room stayed heavy as the sky darkened. He handed her a pair of worn boots. "They're too big for you, but better than nothing," he said. She slid them on. The leather stiff but warm. He gave her his scarf, too, wrapping it carefully around her neck. It smelled faintly of wood smoke. She didn't realize until then how close they were standing, and she had to look away. When the last bit of light was gone, he put out the fire. The room fell into shadow, lit only by a thin beam of moonlight slipping through the curtains. "Stay close to me," he said, opening the door. The cold hit them immediately, sharp and biting. Snow crunched under their boots as they stepped into the night. They moved through the back alleys, avoiding the main streets where patrols might be. Her alien eyes adjusted quickly to the darkness, but she kept glancing at him. making sure he was still there, every sound the creak of ice. The faint hum of a distant generator made her flinch. He walked ahead with steady steps, checking each corner before they turned. After nearly an hour, they reached the edge of the colony. Beyond the last row of houses lay open ground, covered in snow that glittered faintly under the moon. Far ahead, dark shapes of forest rose like walls. "That's where we're going," he whispered. "Through the forest?" She asked. "It's the only way," he replied. They started across the snow, their breaths visible in the freezing air. Halfway to the trees, she froze. Voices close. Too close, she turned her head, and in the distance she saw the faint glow of lights moving across the snow. "Searchers. They've seen us," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Run," the human said. They sprinted toward the forest, the sound of their boots pounding against the frozen ground. Shouts rose behind them, and the glow of the lights grew brighter. She stumbled, her legs heavy, but he grabbed her arm and pulled her forward. Branches loomed ahead, and the darkness of the forest swallowed them. The lights behind them flickered between the trees that didn't follow right away. The humans stopped, listening. The wind in the branches covered their breathing. Finally, he said, "We keep moving." She nodded, her chest still heaving. They disappeared deeper into the forest, leaving only the sound of fading footsteps behind. Somewhere ahead lay the place he had promised her, a place where she could finally rest without fear. But as the cold bit deeper and the forest closed in, she realized the journey there would not be easy, and she wasn't sure what was more dangerous, the hunters behind them, or the unknown that lay ahead. The forest was darker than she expected. The trees were tall and close together, their branches heavy with snow. Every step they took crunched softly under their boots. But the sound still seemed loud in the silence. The air was colder here, biting at her cheeks and numbing her fingers even through the scarf he had given her. They had been walking for what felt like hours. Her legs ached, and her breath came out in ragged clouds. She wanted to stop, to rest, but she didn't want to be the reason they slowed down. The human glanced back at her, his eyes searching her face. "You're slowing," he said softly. She gave a small nod, unable to hide it. He scanned the trees, then pointed toward a faint shape in the distance. Through the branches, she could just make out a structure, small, crooked, almost hidden beneath the snow. It looked like an abandoned cabin. "This way," he said, his voice quiet but urgent. When they reached it, he pushed open the warped wooden door. The hinges groaned, but the inside was empty. The air smelled of damp wood and old ash. It wasn't much, but it had walls and a roof. To her, it looked like the most beautiful place in the world. The human stepped inside first, checking every corner before waving her in. She entered slowly, her alien eyes scanning the shadows. There was an old fireplace on one wall, cold and filled with bits of broken wood. 2 small windows were covered with frost, letting in only the faintest silver light from the moon. He set his bag down and began working quickly. Within minutes, he had cleared the fireplace and was stacking dry sticks from a small bundle he had carried. When he struck the match, the sudden flare of light made her flinch. Then the fire caught, its warmth spreading through the room. She moved closer, stretching her hands toward it. The heat sank into her skin, pulling a soft sigh from her lips. The human pulled 2 blankets from his bag. One he set on the floor near the fire. The other he handed to her. "You'll sleep here," he said, nodding to the spot he had cleared. She hesitated, looking at the single blanket he had kept for himself. "It's not enough for you," she said. He shrugged. "I've slept in worse." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the faint whistle of wind outside. She studied him in the flickering light, the tired lines on his face, the rough calluses on his hands, the way his eyes always seemed to be listening for something beyond the walls. "You've done this before," she said suddenly. "Done what?" he asked. "Run, hide, protect someone," she replied. He didn't answer right away, just stared into the fire. "Maybe," he said finally. His voice low, but not like this. Something about the way he said it made her chest feel heavy. She wanted to ask what he meant, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she pulled the blanket tighter around her and sat down on the floor beside him. The warmth from the fire was good, but it was his presence that made her feel safe, even though danger still waited out there in the dark. Right now, inside this cabin, she felt like she could breathe. After a while, he leaned back against the wall, his eyes closing briefly. "You should sleep," he said. She shook her head. "Not yet. You'll need your strength for tomorrow." He insisted. She hesitated, then lay down on the blanket, her body sinking into the rough but warm fabric. The firelight flickered across the walls, and her eyelids grew heavy. Just before she drifted off, she heard him moving. She opened her eyes slightly and saw him take off his jacket, then place it gently over her. "You need it more than I do," he murmured, almost to himself. She closed her eyes fully then, but her heart was pounding. No one had ever done something like that for her before. The wind howled outside, but the cabin held its warmth. For the first time in years, she didn't dream of running or hiding. She dreamed of the fire, the quiet, and the steady sound of his breathing beside her. It was, without a doubt, the warmest night of her life. When she woke, the fire had burned low, but his jacket was still around her shoulders. He was sitting near the door, watching the faint light of dawn creep through the frost-covered windows. She realized then that he hadn't slept at all. He had stayed awake, guarding her, and in that moment, she understood, whatever dangers waited ahead, he would face them before he ever let them touch her. The morning air was still cold, but the forest was quiet. No voices, no lights, no sound of boots crunching the snow. For the first time in days, the alien girl didn't wake with her heart racing. She lay still for a moment, feeling the warmth of the human's jacket wrapped around her shoulders. It smelled of wood smoke and something else, something she had started to think of as safety. The human was near the fireplace, adding fresh wood to the flames. He glanced at her when she stirred, a small, tired smile on his face. "You're awake," he said softly. She sat up, pulling the blanket closer around herself. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked. "Not much," he admitted. "Had to make sure no one followed us." Her chest tightened. "You shouldn't have to watch over me all the time," she said quietly. He shrugged. "Doesn't matter," he replied. "You're here. You're safe. That's all that matters." Those words stayed with her, lingering like the warmth of the fire. They ate a small breakfast, just bread and dried meat, and then he began talking about the next steps. "There's an old human outpost not far from here," he explained. "It's abandoned, but the walls are still solid, and there's a working heater inside." Her eyes widened. "A heater?" she repeated. He nodded. "And a bed, maybe." 2. The thought of another bed made her hesitate. She remembered the first night in his house, how she had feared the offer, but now the idea didn't feel frightening anymore. It felt like something she wanted. They left the cabin in the late morning, walking through the forest until the trees began to thin. Snow crunched under their boots, and the sunlight, pale and cold, filtered through the branches. The outpost appeared just past a ridge, a squat building made of metal and stone, its roof heavy with snow. He approached carefully, checking the door before pushing it open. Inside, the air was stale but warmer than she expected. Dust lay thick on the floor, but the structure was solid. A single large room opened before them, and against one wall was a bed frame. The mattress looked worn but not broken. Beside it, an old heater hummed faintly as he tested it. "It works," he said with a grin. She stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at the bed. It wasn't like the one in his house. This one was smaller, rougher, but still, it was a bed. Her throat felt tight. "You should take it," she said finally. He shook his head. "We'll share." The words hit her like a strange warmth spreading through her chest. In her culture, sharing a bed meant trust, safety, and something deeper. She glanced at him, searching for any sign of mockery or hidden meaning. But there was none. He meant it simply, honestly that night. The heater filled the room with steady warmth. They sat near it, talking quietly about small things, the food they would need, the safest paths to avoid patrols, the places he had seen beyond the colony. But as the hours passed, their voices grew softer. It was no longer just planning, it was learning about each other. Piece by piece, when they finally lay down, the space between them on the bed felt small. She could hear his breathing, steady and calm. It was a sound she had never thought she would find comforting. "You're still awake," he murmured after a while. "Yes," she admitted. "Cold?" he asked. "No," she said truthfully. "Not anymore." She turned slightly, her eyes meeting his in the dim light. "I never had a warm bed before I met you," she whispered. He didn't answer right away, just looked at her for a long moment, his gaze steady. "Then you'll never have a cold one again," he said finally. Something in her chest loosened, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time she believed the words, not because the bed was warm, but because the person beside her had made it so. Outside, the wind moved through the forest, but inside, the walls held strong, the heater hummed, the blankets were heavy, and the space they shared was filled with quiet safety. It wasn't just a bed anymore, it was home, and as she closed her eyes, she knew she would never go back to the life she had before. She had found something far greater than shelter. She had found a place and a person she could trust. And in that small, warm room, with the human beside her, the bed was no longer cold, and neither was she.